Hi, welcome to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. I am your host, Eric Bjornstad, your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. The Fuel Pulse Show podcast is a podcast for anyone who uses fuel or who has things that use fuel. That means whether at home or at work, and it's for both consumers and for professionals who work in jobs where they may have to manage fuel as one of their professional responsibilities. Fuel that has to be managed so that it can be used in some capacity to get the job done. That means the Fuel Pulse Show podcast is for everyone. So, what are we going to talk about today? Well, this is part two of a podcast series that is basically answering the question: if you have a microbial contamination problem in your stored fuel system, how can you get rid of it? And we already did part one, so I would strongly recommend that if you haven't seen it yet, that you go back and you listen to or view part one, because in part one, we kind of laid the groundwork. We talked about microbial contamination. We talked about things like the conventional ways that people try to assess whether they've got a problem, the symptoms that they look for, the problems that can arise if they ignore those symptoms or if they simply don't recognize those symptoms and then let the problem kind of progress to its zenith, so to speak. And we said that in order to get rid of a microbial problem, you needed to do three main steps. And the first step, which we covered in the last half of part one, was you need to get rid of all the water or as much of the water as possible. That meant mechanically suctioning it out from the bottom of the tank and then using a water scavenging or water absorbing chemical circulated into the fuel that would absorb or mop up the remaining trace amounts of water, because it is virtually impossible to mechanically get all of the water out. And we talked about how microbes do not need very much water in order to make the problem come back again. So that was part one. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the second and the third things that you need to do, the essential steps really to solving and getting rid of this kind of microbial contamination problem. So let's jump right into it. So the next thing you want to do after you had taken care of the water is you need to clean up any biomass or biofilm that may be adhered to the walls or the surfaces of the tank and its system. Now, over the course of talking about this, sometimes we'll use the term biomass, sometimes we will use the term biofilm. They both refer to the same thing. Microbes, as they go through their life cycles and they do what they do, they reproduce, they grow, they consume things, and they will excrete biofilms during their life cycle. Biofilms or biomass is this almost sticky matrix of biological material, and it will end up sticking to whatever solid surfaces it comes across. Microbes will then use this biofilm as a housing almost, where they will go inside of it and they will use it to grow and thrive, and they will actually form complex colonies. In fact, if you were to be able to shrink yourself down to microscopic size and go down into a layer of biofilm that might be on the wall of a tank, what you would find thousands upon thousands of not just microbes, but different species and different types of microbes, all living in there, all kind of symbiotically growing and reproducing. I say symbiotically because there are many types of microbes that grow best when they live alongside another type of microbe that basically gives them what they need. They give that microbe what it needs. They have a symbiotic relationship. And so biofilm will house kind of a almost like its own little biome of microbial community, so to speak. And so it is very important to solve a micro problem. It's very important to get rid of, to clean out as much of that biofilm and biomass as you can. So, proper tank cleaning and proper remediation of microbial contamination involves cleaning all of that out. However, like getting rid of the water, cleaning out the biofilm and the biomass from your tank is easier said than done, but it is important to do. And we're going to talk about at least two reasons why. First reason, we know that microbes contribute to corrosion damage in tanks. They do this in a number of ways. One way is through the acidic byproducts that they create, but there are other ways too. Uh, the biofilms that these microbes produce and live in, these biofilms themselves can accelerate tank corrosion, again, in at least two ways. First way is with the biomass existing on the surface of the tank, it will create what's called a galvanic coupling difference on the metal surface of the tank. This is a situation where electrons will start to flow between the metal and the biomass. And when this happens, corrosion processes and corrosion damage occurs and accelerates in that area. And it's all because the biomass helped to create this galvanic couple. Also, this one's really interesting. Biomass, layers of biomass on a tank surface can actually trap pockets of oxygen on the tank surface, on the metal of the tank surface, and that will lead to corrosion damage. How so? Well, many times in a tank, you'll have a layer, you'll have a fuel layer, right? And you'll have a water layer on the bottom, and you'll have an interface in between them. And then on the sides of the tank surface, on the sides of the tank, you will get biomass and biofilm formations made by these microbes. And so many times you will get some of this biomass that's on the surface of the tank by the interface of the water. Now, remember, we talked about that microbes like to grow in the biomass. They also like to grow at the surface of the or the interface between the fuel and the water. Now, what happens is that you have a principle of osmosis that comes into play. Now, osmosis is a scientific principle that says when you have two areas where you had different concentrations of something like oxygen, and oxygen is the relevant element in this case. If you have two areas where the oxygen concentration differs, the principle of osmosis dictates that the oxygen is going to want to move from the area of high concentration to the area of low concentration. Now, in this case, you have two areas that do have differing amounts of oxygen in them. You have fuel and you have water. Now, everybody knows that water has a certain amount of dissolved oxygen, but not very many people know that fuel, diesel fuel, actually can dissolve and contain more dissolved oxygen than water does. And so what happens is oxygen will want to move from the fuel phase into the water phase. Now, when it starts doing this, remember we had this biomass that was on the sides of the tank right by the interface. And so as the oxygen starts moving from the fuel into the water, what will happen is because the biomass happens to be in the area, you will get some of that oxygen will get trapped in the pockets of the biomass, and you will get pockets of high oxygen concentration. And then what happens is the microbes that live in that area, they will feed on the oxygen and use the oxygen to form acids like carbonic acid. And that acid will then eat into and damage tank metal surfaces. So those are two ways, at least two ways, that this seemingly innocent biofilm plays a critical role in actually damaging storage tanks. And so that speaks to this principle of people not really taking biomass that seriously. They think, well, yeah, I think I've got some of that in there, and I know I need to kill the microbes, but the biomass, I don't really need to worry about that. Well, biomass is not a good thing to have in there, and so you want to clean it out. Now, All of that we just talked about was the first reason, or the first good reason, why you want to clean out biofilm in order to help eradicate a microbial problem. The second, there's a second big reason too. As we've mentioned before, just mentioned it just a minute ago, microbes live in and behind the biofilm. The biofilm actually protects or shields them from things like biocide that might be put into fuel to try and kill the microbes. So if you don't remove the biofilm, if you allow it to stay in there and you allow those microbes to hide in within and behind that biofilm, then what's going to happen is you're going to apply biocide to kill all the microbes that you can, and it's going to kill all the microbes it gets to in the fuel. And you may even do a test of that fuel, and that fuel comes back clean. Your microbe problem is solved. Yay. However, there are still all of those microbes that are hiding behind in and behind that biomass that the biocide could not get to because they were being protected, they were being shielded. And so what happens then is the next time that storage tank gets a fuel drop, what's going to happen? That fuel's going to get dropped in there, the fuel's going to get kicked up in there, and very often what happens is with the fuel getting kicked up, it dislodges or disturbs this biomass that's in there. And then what happens is all those microbes that were in and behind the biomass, they come out and they essentially re-inoculate the previously clean system. And so we have actually had, over the course of our company working in this sphere, we would have situations where a tank would be cleaned, it would be treated with biocide, the microbial problem would be solved, there would be negligible microbial growth. And then literally a couple weeks later, someone would do a microbial test and their microbe levels would be back to being severe. And the question was, well, how in the world could that happen? And the reason that happened was because they got re-inoculated. The system got re-inoculated because they got a fuel drop, and that biomass was disturbed and broken open by the action of the fuel. And all those microbes that had been protected from being killed by the biocide went back to doing what they normally want to do, and they had a microbe problem again. So, another reason why it is very important to try and clean out as much of that biomass as you can, or at least try to break it up so that the microbes have fewer places to hide when you're trying to get rid of them. So, we should be able to see by now that cleaning out the biomass is an important part of getting rid of a microbial problem. But how do you do that? The best way to solve or to clean out the biomass is through what they call man entry. Man entry is the process where someone has to dress up in a hazmat suit and they actually have to go into the tank. The man has to enter the tank. Now, obviously, this only applies to large storage tanks large enough for a person to go into. The person goes into the tank and manually cleans it out. Now, on the one hand, man entry is probably the only way that you're going to be able to be sure to be able to get all of that out. However, it's really, really expensive, especially from an insurance standpoint. So it's expensive, but it's the best way to do it. So you've got those two competing considerations. Now, all of these fuel polishers that clean tanks and polish and clean up fuel, very, very few fuel polishers actually practice man entry. Instead, what they will do is they will attempt to clean out as much of the biomass as possible from the outside. They will use stingers and suction hoses, and they will use pressure spray to try and dislodge almost remotely, to remotely dislodge and suction out as much of the biomass as they think that they can get. But without going into the tank in a man entry fashion, it's virtually impossible to get it all, it's really, really difficult even to get close to most of it. But that's basically what they do. Now, short of doing these two things, man entry, and then we'll call it cleaning via stinger. That's not really a good way to put it, but short of those two things, there's something else that you can do, and that is that you can actually use a chemical dispersant that is added to the fuel. And what the chemical dispersant will do is it will actually go to the biofilm and it will attack it, and it will almost punch holes in it. It will break it up. And that has a couple of important effects. First thing it does is it makes it easier to remove, makes it easier for then any subsequent effort by a fuel polisher or anyone else to use suction and stingers. It makes it easier to remove because it started to break up the surface of that biomass. And that's important. However, equally important is as it breaks up and attacks the biomass and punches holes in it, what it does is it increases the ability for any follow-up biocide that's put into the fuel. It increases the ability for that biocide to penetrate the biofilm and get at and kill all those microbes that it could not have gotten to before. So really using a chemical dispersant to break up and attack the biomass is actually a great way to markedly improve the efficacy of a biocide chemical that you're going to use later on. So when do you add this kind of chemical dispersant? Remember, before we talked about you could use a water scavenger chemical, and now you can use a dispersant chemical. And you can add both of those at the same time. You want to add those at the beginning of the process. And by the beginning, we mean you've mechanically suctioned out all of that water. You add the water absorbing chemical. Then at that point, you can then add this dispersant chemical as well. The reason you want to do it then is because you want to give both of those plenty of time for them to work. So step one in solving a microbial problem is removing as much water as possible. Step two is to clean out as much biofilm and biomass as possible, even if it means using a chemical to try and break it up. And that brings us to the most important step in the process, which is we have to add something to the tank that will kill the microbes. Now remember, we talked about removing water, but we have to remember that just removing water does not kill microbes. It's a really important thing to do. That's why we said it was step number one. But removing the water is not going to kill the microbes. In order to kill the microbes, you have to use a biocide. Biocide is a registered chemical, a chemical that has the express purpose of killing biological organisms. It kills things. In this case, it kills microbes. And it is really the only thing that will solve that problem. Now, in previous episodes of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast, we did talk about how to know if something that you've got, a chemical that you've got, is actually a biocide. And we talked about it because there are lots of things on the market that will make vague allusions to doing what biocides do, like killing microbes. They'll make vague allusions that they have the ability to do that when they don't actually have the ability to do that. They just cause consumer confusion. So if you're unclear about whether the thing that you have actually is a biocide and actually will kill microbes, it might be worth your while to go back and listen to that episode, because it is really important that when you're doing this third step, you use an actual biocide, something that is legally registered for that purpose. Because in order to be legally registered as a biocide, you actually have to prove that you do what a biocide is supposed to do. So you know now, you're at the point now where you're like, okay, we need to pick a biocide to use. So for choosing what to use to do this, there are probably there are options. You have options to do this. There's probably 6 or 7 main biocide chemistries that you can pretty easily find out in the marketplace if you look. Now, there are 6 or 7 of them. That doesn't mean that they're all the same. Some of them are better than others. So some of these, the first one we'll say is the product BioBor, which is probably the most well known. The chemistry that it uses. We'll call it a diboronane chemistry. There's a chemistry called isothiazolone, trade name Cathon FP 1.5. There's a chemistry called nitromorpholin. There's a chemistry called glutaraldehyde. There's a chemistry called thiocyanate. That's the Belicide biocide. And there's a chemistry known by the acronym MBO, commonly known as Clearkill. So all of these, whether it's BioBor, whether it's Belicide, thiocyanate, Clearkill, nitromorpholin, whatever, all of these are what they call broad spectrum biocide chemistries. And that means they are supposed to kill a broad variety of the kinds of microbes that are commonly found in fuel storage situations. Now, just because they are supposed to do that doesn't mean that they all do that equally well. As in, for example, killing different kinds of microbes equally well. Bacteria versus fungi versus molds and yeasts. They all kill all those kinds, but they may not all do them equally well in all situations, nor do they all maintain their max kills for an equally long period of time. Now, we don't want to spend a lot of time comparing and contrasting all of these, but we will say that of the most commonly found biocides, the most well known is the first one that we mentioned, BioBor, or BioBor JF as its official name. Now, the makers of BioBor had done a really good job of leveraging and developing their name recognition, and it all comes from the past, from the fact that they were the first biocide that was approved for use in jet fuel. Hence why the BioBor's actual name is BioBor JF. Now, the reason why it worked well enough in jet fuel that it got this official FAA approval to be used in jet fuel is because jet fuel does not have any water in it, or it's not supposed to. Water is like the big no-no for jet fuel because, of course, when you get up in the higher altitudes, that water is going to freeze, plug something up that it's not supposed to, and you got problems. So jet fuel is supposed to be the driest fuel possible. And it just so happens that BioBor, when it comes into contact with water, it has a funny little quirk about it in that in chemistry speak, we would say it dissociates. That means that when the active molecules in BioBor come into contact with water, they actually break apart and they break into inert subcomponents. So imagine it like this: you have a fuel tank, and so we're not talking about a jet fuel tank; we're just talking about a regular fuel tank, and you put some BioBor in it because it's the only one that you've heard of, right? And you're trying to kill a microbe problem, so you say, let's put some BioBor in it. So you put BioBor in the fuel. Now, what happens is it's going to move through the fuel, and it's going to be killing stuff that it comes across like any other biocide. When it reaches the interface with the water, it's going to come to the interface. There's lots of microbes there, so it's going to be killing those. So far, so good. Then it's going to move across the interface in a process of what they call partitioning. It's going to partition or move across the interface from the fuel into the water. Now, as soon as it gets into the water, what's going to happen? The BioBor, the diboronane molecules are going to break apart and they're going to split into innocuous, what they call innocuous or inert components, like boric acid being one of them. Now, if you've got a microbial problem and you use this in a storage tank that has free water in it, that is not what you want to have happen. What you wanted to have happen was the biocide killed everything in the fuel, partitioned into the water, stayed intact, kept on killing. But that's not what BioBore does. But basically, the dispute has to do with the fact that the BioBore's manufacturer claims that it doesn't matter if BioBore breaks apart in the water, it still kills microbes in the water. Everybody who has a biocide chemistry has to register it, and they have to submit a boatload of technical information. And one of the most important things in the technical information is they have to identify what they call the biocidal ingredient. They have to identify what is the molecule or the component in the formulation of this biocide that does the actual killing of the microbes. Now, BioBore has identified a certain molecule or molecules that kill microbes. It's in their registration. And all of these registrations, incidentally, are public domain. Anybody can look this up. So they have identified the biocidal ingredient or biocidal component of their formulation. The problem with them disputing this inactivation in water scenario is they're saying that even though it breaks apart and forms two different components, those two components, according to them, still go on killing microbes. And so they basically rely on the fact that not a lot of people know that BioBore doesn't really do well when you've got water in your system. And unfortunately for them, they can use it in jet fuel. I think they are still the only biocide that's approved for use in aviation fuel. But for everybody else has water in their tanks. And for everybody else, BioBore may not be the best solution to knock out microbial problems. So going back to all the other biocides. So adding biocide is the third essential step for getting rid of a microbial problem. Now we need to talk about how you do that. And there are certain considerations that we have to know. I mean, it's nice to know, okay, we have to add biocide, but it's one thing to go from that to actually doing it. So what kinds of considerations do we have to think about? Well, the first one is how much do you need to add? How much biocide do you need to use? Every formulation is required to have a recommendation for a recommended treat rate. And many of them will have different treat rates for specific situations. So whatever the recommended treat rate is for the biocide that you selected to use, you will want to follow that. You should follow that, because these treat rates have been developed based on all of this technical testing information that was all derived and listed in their official biocide registration testing data that they submitted to get approved in the first place. So it is important that you pay attention to what they're recommending. Now, a common treat rate for a number of these biocides might be 1 ounce to about 40 gallons of fuel. That translates roughly to about 1 to 5,000. 1 gallon of biocide into 5,000 gallons of fuel. If you wanted to get metric, you could say it's 200 parts per million. For every million parts of fuel or water, liquid, you're putting in 200 parts of your biocide. So that's a fairly common treat rate, about 1 to 5,000. Now, having said that, if we're using it in the real world, there is a common situation that comes up that leads to an important question being asked. So let's consider that. Let's say you have a storage tank. It's a 5,000 gallon storage tank. Or let's say it's a 6,000 gallon storage tank and it has a working capacity of 5,000. But you don't have 5,000 gallons in it. It's about half full. So it has 2,500 gallons of fuel. And you need to treat that with biocide to get rid of a microbial problem. How much biocide do you need to add? Because the biocide that you have says use 1 to 5,000. Okay. So how much biocide do you need to add given the fact that it's a 5,000 gallon tank, but you've only got 2,500 gallons of actual fuel in there? So how much? If you treated for the full capacity, 5,000 gallons, you would need to use 1 gallon of biocide. But if you only treat for the amount of liquid that's in there, the amount of fuel and water that's in there, that's 2,500 gallons. That means you only need half a gallon. So what's the right answer? Do you use half a gallon or do you use a full gallon of biocide? And the answer really depends on the consideration of if you are expecting additional fuel to be added in the near future. And so that means your answer depends on the situation. So let's unpack that a little bit. The important thing here is however much fuel's in the tank that the biocide is going into, you need to have enough biocide in that fuel, whatever volume it is. You need to have enough biocide in that fuel to be able to kill the microbes in it. In this case, that means you need to have, remember, 200 parts per million of biocide in whatever fuel's in there. So if you treat for 2,500 gallons, so you add half a gallon of biocide, okay, so far so good. But then you get a fuel drop the next day and more fuels added on top of that. What's going to happen? Biocide concentration is going to be diluted. And if you filled it up to 5,000 gallons, then you're only really going to have half of the biocide in there that you need. You're only going to have 100 parts per million. So the recommendation in those kind of situations is you actually want to treat for the total volume of the storage tank. So you would actually want to treat as if you had 5,000 gallons of fuel in there, which means you would add 1 gallon. So that means that if you used 1 gallon in there, if you add any more fuel in there, you're still going to have enough biocide in that new volume of fuel to keep killing the microbes. Also, and this is another important consideration, especially in fuel systems that get regular additions of fuel. Let's say, going back to this fuel tank, it's only half full, right? So the fuel's only halfway up the sides of that tank. All the surfaces above that fuel line, there's microbes on there. There's biomass on there most likely. But if you put biocide in that fuel, all the microbes up here are not getting contact with biocide. But if you add additional fuel to that, what's going to happen to the fuel volume? It, of course, is going to rise. And if you have the proper amount of biocide in the fuel so that when a fuel drop's added, all that fuel that's rising up and making contact with the sides of the tank, it's all that fuel still going to have enough biocide to kill everything that's located on the upper tank surfaces. And that is what you want to have happen. And so you want to make sure you've got enough biocide in the fuel volume in order for it to do that effectively if you get a fuel drop. And this exact same recommendation also goes not just for the biocide, but for that dispersant chemical, the biomass dispersant chemical that we talked about in step 2. Exact same consideration. You treat for the amount, the working maximum volume of the tank, not just for the lower volume of fuel that happens to be in that tank at that particular time. Treat for the total volume of the tank, not the actual volume of fuel that happens to be in there. So now you have added biocide, and let's say you've also got biomass dispersant in there. You probably also have water scavenging. So you got 3 chemicals in there. So all 3 of them are in there. So the next step that you have to do is you need to circulate the fuel. You want to circulate the fuel because you need to get all of these chemicals well mixed into the fuel. Circulation is the best way to do that. Now, in the past, some people have said, well, all that they need to do is they just put the biocide, whatever chemicals, you just put it in on top, and they leave it to diffuse naturally through the fuel. And if you give it enough time, it will eventually work its way through. But that's not good practice to do that. You don't know how long it's going to take. And in these types of situations, time is money. You need to circulate the fuel to make sure that you get the best, most complete mixing of the chemicals into the fuel. In fact, many biocide labels, once they have defined how much used, they will specifically mention that you need to do this in order to make sure that the biocide is as well mixed into the fuel volume as possible. Because remember, biocides are like lots of other chemicals. Biocides only work when they come into physical proximity to what they're supposed to kill. And circulation of the fuel is the best way to ensure that this is going to happen and happen most completely. Now, how long do you circulate? That's another important question. The answer to that is perhaps not as long as you might think, but it does depend on the volume of the fuel. The smaller the fuel volume, the shorter amount of time you need to do this. So let's say if you've got 1,000 gallons in there, or maybe 2,000 gallons, a couple thousand gallons or less, you might circulate for 30 minutes. But if you've got a larger tank and you've got 5,000 gallons or 10,000 gallons of fuel that you treated, you might want to circulate between an hour and 2 hours. These are not hard and fast rules. There is no linear chart that dictates, if you've got 6,000 gallons, you need to do it for 101.5 minutes. No, there's nothing like that. These are not hard and fast rules. These are more like general recommendations. And the reason we point this out is because you can adjust these based on what else you've got to do. More on that in a minute here, because that is a consideration. So once the treatment chemicals, you've added those, you've circulated the fuel, so they are well mixed in. What now? Now you leave them to work. This is when what's called residency time becomes a factor. A good biocide is going to start killing immediately. Immediately when it comes across microbes, it's going to start killing those. But it's going to take a longer period of time for it to kill all the microbes because it's got to reach all the microbes and it's got to keep killing those. How long it takes to achieve a complete kill depends on factors including how much fuel's in the tank. Now, when they do kill studies for biocides, kill studies are done in a laboratory. So it's a smaller controlled environment, right? And typically they will treat an inoculated sample that has a defined number of microbes, usually some huge number, and they'll add biocide to it, and they'll see how long it takes or how quickly it starts killing and how long it takes to knock those microbial counts down to the level they need them to be. And most microbial kill studies will show meaningful depletions of microbial counts within 30 minutes at the most. However, that's different from what happens in the real world. And we would recommend that if you're using a biocide out in the real world, in a real world tank, you need to allow at least, let's say, 3 hours of residency time. Preferably, you want to allow between 8 and 24 hours of residency time before you move on to doing next steps. Now, that being said, we give you this recommendation between 3, 8, 24 hours. This recommendation applies if you're not going to do what for many people is a key next step, which is fuel polishing. In other words, some people will add biocide and they'll circulate all of it in, but they don't have the ability to do fuel filtration or fuel polishing. They want to kill the microbes and then they're going to leave it. There's lots of people in that situation. So for those people, they need to wait at least 3 to 8 to 24 hours before they go to start using the fuel. But for many others, what they intend to do is they intend to apply the biocide, apply the biomass breakup dispersant, but then they're going to filter the fuel. They're going to do fuel polishing. If they're doing fuel polishing, the fuel polishing will actually act as a circulation. And they can go ahead and do fuel polishing pretty much pretty shortly after they've added the chemicals and circulated them in. But for the other people, they need to wait a certain amount of time. So that brings us to a part that we would say fuel filtration and settling of dead microbes. Let's talk about that. So we've gotten rid of the water, as much of water as we're going to be able to get out. We've circulated in both biocide and biomass dispersant to try and break some of that up. The next step for many of those people is going to be fuel filtration or fuel polishing. Now, like I said, if by chance you're not going to do that, we say you need to wait between 3 and 24 hours before using the fuel. Now, we've said this a number of times. There's a reason why. And the reason why you need to wait a certain amount of time is the biocide is going to be killing those microbes. When microbes are killed, they don't disappear. You got a bunch of dead microbes floating around in that fuel, and those microbes have to go somewhere. If you wait a certain amount of time, if you wait the requisite amount of time, between 3 and 24 hours, then what's going to happen is all those dead microbes are going to, by gravity, they're going to fall down and settle at the bottom of the tank. If you don't wait to do that, if you decide to use the fuel immediately, what's going to happen is all those dead microbes are still going to be in the fuel. That means they are going to end up in the fuel filters, and you're going to have a bunch of plugged fuel filters that are going to need to be changed. You need to keep that in mind. So, you complete all the steps, remove water, remove as much biocide as you're going to get out, add the appropriate chemicals, mix them in. Next, you do fuel filtration if that's your plan. Otherwise, you're waiting a certain amount of time to let the biocide kill the microbes, let them settle down to the bottom of the tank. If you do all of those things, you have reached the end of the chemical application and mechanical parts of the process. But there's one final thing that you need to do if you're going to do this whole thing right, and that is post-testing. So remember at the start, we talked about testing the fuel beforehand, what we would call pre-testing, because it was the only way for you to know for sure and assess for sure, not just whether you have a microbe problem, but the how serious, to what level your microbe problem is. Pre-testing with a good microbial testing method like ATP bifiltration is an important step because, as we said, it gives you the benefit of a better defined problem, and it's the only thing that will tell you how bad the problem actually is, and you need to have that knowledge to start with. So you did that. You took all of these steps to then attack and solve and eradicate the problem. Now that all that is done, your final step is you have to verify whether or not you were completely successful in what you did. See, there is a common mistake that's done by fuel polishers and other kinds of people who tend to get paid, let's say, by the job. And that common mistake is they do all the work, and then once they finish their process, as soon as they finish their process, they're gone. They leave right after they complete whatever their process happened to be. They don't verify that the contamination is eradicated. They assume that it is. And of course, that's assuming they actually followed through on all the things that they were supposed to beforehand. Now, why don't they complete the job? Why don't they take that essential last step? Because that takes time. Well, that's number one. There's several reasons. Number one is it takes time, which they may not want to stick around to do that. They may have another job they have to go to. Time is money, remember? So it takes time. Or it might be they don't know how to do it because testing methods are something that are not that well known within the industry. Or they may have already convinced the customer that once the process is completed, they've convinced the customer that they are the experts, and if they did their recommended process, the problem is going to be solved. The customer doesn't need anything else. And since the customer selected this entity to do the job, people tend to want to believe that they make good decisions, right? And so the customer has selected this fuel polisher because they believe that they are the expert. The fuel polisher said, yes, all we need to do is do this fuel polishing, and once we're done, you're good. So the customer is going to take their word by default. So when the process is done, they pull a sample that visually might show that the fuel is good, fuel looks good, fuel looks like the customer expects it to. They're done and they are gone, except they have not done post-testing to prove that they've solved the problem. But post-testing is very, very important. That's going to be your last step in fully solving a microbial problem. So post-testing is the best way, the only way to know if a microbial contamination problem's actually been solved. And it's especially important. This is a nuance that slips by a lot of people. Post-testing is especially important in cases of severe contamination because, believe it or not, sometimes even when you apply the recommended amount of biocide and you do it correctly and you follow all of these steps, sometimes it doesn't completely kill all the microbes. There might be some microbes left over. Now, usually the recommended biocide dosages that you will refer to for guidance, usually they will stipulate different treat rates for contamination levels that are, let's say, considered normal versus severe. They will actually stipulate that you use more biocide if the contamination is deemed severe. But severe is kind of a catch-all designation, right? Some contaminations are, like in animal farms, some animals are more equal than others. Some contaminations are more severe than others. And so there may be times, actually, let me amend that. There will come a time when you might have to repeat the process. Now, that if you have to do that, it doesn't mean the process was faulty. It's because not all microbial situations are equally serious. So let's think about this from a numbers standpoint. Sometimes you may be doing all this to eliminate or treat a contamination problem where the amount of microbes that you tested came out. If you did an ATP biofiltration test, it tested out at, let's say, 100,000 microbes per milliliter. That will be reflected in a test result, which is about 100 picograms per milliliter. That's what we consider to be borderline severe. It's not negligible, but it is borderline severe. So it's not nothing, so to speak. So sometimes you'll go ahead and you'll treat to knock that out. But you might have another tank, another situation where the contamination level is much more severe. You might have a contamination level that tests not at 100,000, but at 10 million microbes per milliliter, which would be a result on an ATP test of about 10,000 picograms. That is pretty severe. So the rhetorical question here is, if you've got both of these, why is it reasonable to assume that the same amount of biocide would completely kill both amounts of microbes when one of them is, 100 times greater than the other? The answer is obviously that one of those situations may well require more biocide than the other. And so that's why you have to keep in mind. Sometimes you have to use more, sometimes you have to repeat a process. And post-testing is necessary both to confirm that the problem is fixed and also to confirm in cases where it didn't quite get fixed, to confirm whether you need to do follow-up or repeat treatment in order to fully get that situation where you need it to be. Now, when should you do post-testing? In other words, when should you pull the sample for testing? So this is where we talk about time considerations here as we head down the home stretch. So for post-testing, you actually want to do this as soon after the process is finished as you want. And by that, we mean as soon after you finish the polishing process or the filtration process. You can do this as soon after that's finished as you want. So after you finish circulating the chemicals in and done any filtration that you're going to do. You don't necessarily need to wait a certain amount of time afterwards, with one caveat. And that is, unless you're one of those people who does on site testing and you're using an ATP test and you're going to pull a sample and you're going to test it immediately right there. There's lots of people who do that. And that's actually a really good way to do it. But if you're going to do it that way, then what you don't want to do is to pull a sample immediately and test that. The rationale for not doing that is if you pull a treated sample, assuming that it's representative of the system that it's from, the biocide in that sample is still going to be killing the microbes that's in that sample. It's going to continue to kill the microbes. It's going to continue to be working all along up to the point that you do the test. So let's say, for example, that the biocide needs 3 hours to achieve a reasonably complete kill. So what happens if you immediately pull a sample and you test it 5 minutes later? What are you going to see? Well, that test is going to show that not all the microbes have been killed because you tested too soon. Now, contrast that with what is probably a more common scenario where a technician goes out, services a tank, treats the tank, pulls, does all the things that they're supposed to do, and they pull a sample, a treated sample, for post testing. But they don't test it right there because they don't have the ATP equipment there. They're going to pull the sample, they put it on ice, they're handling it properly, they're taking all the necessary steps. They take it back to their laboratory facility at the end of the day, put it in the refrigerator. The next day, the lab techs come in, they take that sample and they test it. And it's been about 12 hours after it was sampled. The result that they're going to see when they test it after 12 hours should mirror what the microbial counts in the tank are going to be 12 hours. Now remember, biocide took 3 hours, give or take, to work. So theoretically, you're going to get a better result if you do that. And that is because you did not test too soon. So with respect to when you should do post-testing, there's no limit on how soon you should do testing, apart from the fact that you need to allow for the biocide to allow for the amount of time to pass that mirrors how long it takes for the biocide to do a complete kill. That's the limit on one end. What about on the other end? Now, what do I mean by that? What about the question of how late should you do testing? So first we said, how soon can you do testing, this kind of testing? Now it's how long can you wait in order to do that kind of testing? That answer depends really on logistical considerations, on when you can actually get out to pull samples based on anything else you might actually, happen to be doing. We say this because there are a lot of professional field polishers who will use this kind of process, and they have to factor those considerations into their planning because they'll have jobs scheduled, and those jobs mean that they can't just decide to go back to a previous location and pull a sample, let's say the next morning, because they're already supposed to be somewhere else. So for the post test, for those people, it doesn't matter if you pull the sample immediately and test it 24 hours later or 3 days later. That does not matter. As long as you know how long time has passed after the sample has been pulled. That being said, though, what you don't want to do is, note I said, doesn't matter if you pull it and then test it 24 hours later or 3 days. I didn't say 1 week because it does matter how long you wait. You don't want to wait. You don't want to pull a sample and then test it a week later or 2 weeks later. What it is okay to do is it is okay to go back to the tank a week later, pull the sample and test it, within 12 hours or 4 hours or whatever. There's a difference in those two approaches. The important thing is Whichever way you're going to do it, you handle the sample correctly, you run the microbe test as soon as feasibly possible after you've pulled it. Ideally, within 4 to 24 hours, just like we said before, because the longer the time passes between when you pull the sample and when you test, the less valid your results are going to be. So, up to this point, if you've got a clean post test, that means you're done. Congratulations, you have successfully remediated a microbe problem and you've done it in best practice fashion. You are good to go. Now what? What do you do now? Well, now the goal is to keep the tank and the system clean for as long as you can. Well, how do you do that? Well, there are a number of suggestions that you can do, and some of them, if you've been paying attention, you may be able to think of some of them. You want to keep tap on your water content. It's always recommended in the course of good fuel husbandry or good fuel housekeeping that you want to check your water content. You want to remove water when it reaches, let's say, a maximum of an inch. You don't need to remove it when there's a quarter inch in there, but you do not want to let 2 or 3 inches of water build up in that system. You need to check it regularly, and you need to remove it when it reaches a certain point. That necessarily means you need to check your fuel on some kind of regular basis. Also, it would be strongly recommended that you consider doing some kind of microbe testing. Now, how often? You don't need to microbe test like every week or even every month. We typically would recommend that you microbe test quarterly. Now, some people might say, I don't want to do it quarterly. Well, if you don't want to do it quarterly, twice a year would be satisfactory. The more often you do that, or the more tests that you do, the better trend analysis you can do, which will give you better information that you need in order to be better prepared the next time you have to deal with this. Now, a key reason why you want to do this kind of microbial testing concerns a question which likely is going to come up when you start considering the need to use a biocide to kill microbes. And that question is, when you do biocide treatment, how long can you expect it to last for? Remember, we talked about biocides have a certain amount of time that it will take for them to do a complete kill. Remember, we said 3 hours, 8 hours, something like that. But the corollary to that is how long can it maintain that kill? Remember when we listed those 6 biocide chemistries and we said they're all broad spectrum, but they're not all equally well. This is one of those areas. Not all of those biocide chemistries are equally good at maintaining complete kills for all of these kinds of microbes for the same amount of time. So, how long can you expect a biocide treatment functionally to last for? So, on the one hand, that's an it depends answer. It depends on environmental conditions, depends on the kind of microbial exposure that your system tends to have over the course of its life and its specific situation. But speaking generally, a really good biocide should be able to maintain a complete or mostly complete kill for about 4 weeks. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that as soon as that 4 weeks is up, boom, you've got corrosion problems. It does not mean that at all. It means that you would expect to start seeing some kind of increase in microbial levels over a period of time after that point. So a really good biocide should be able to maintain complete kill, for about 4 weeks. Therefore, it's important to do microbial testing in the future after you've cleaned your tank and gotten rid of this problem so that you can monitor the microbial levels. After this point, you can see how quickly they rise or slowly they rise over time, and you can stay ahead of this problem. So, what specifically should you do? What's the recommendation? Well, if you're expecting the biocide, like let's say people who use Belicide or Clear Kill, they typically expect a 4-week kill time. BioBore is considerably less than that, but let's use 4 weeks as the cutoff. So you expect a 4-week kill maintenance, so to speak. So then after that 4 weeks passes, you do a retest. You've established the baseline. So you've tested 4 weeks after service. Then you wait 3 months. So you're not testing every week or even every month. You're waiting 3 months. Then you test. You got another data point. Then you test 3 months after that, which would be 6 months after your service. You test then. So now you've got 3 data points, the 4-week, the 3-month, the 6-month. Then from that point on, you can scale back and you could test twice a year. You could test 6 months after that, 6 months after that. As you do this, you'll be gathering more and more data points. You'll be building a trend and a picture of what happens in your specific system with respect to how quickly microbial problems develop. You'll know exactly what's going on in your system, and you'll end up being able to get a really good idea of how often you need to plan for the expense of this kind of service. But the picture that you're going to get is going to be the picture that's right for your specific situation, your specific system. It's not going to be based off of anyone else's considerations. It's going to be what's right for you. So that pretty much wraps everything up. So summarize what we talked about in these last 2 episodes. So once you have confirmed that you have a microbial problem that of the sufficient level that needs attention, and this is preferably done through some kind of testing. Once you've confirmed that, you need to do 3 things. First, you remove whatever water you can through mechanical means, and then you use a water scavenging chemical added to the fuel and circulate it in order to mop up the rest of the water. Then you're going to clean out as much of the biofilm out of the tank as possible. Now, whether you do that mechanically or you can use a biomass dispersant fuel treatment. That will make it easier to do that and will also make the next step more effective, which is you add a biocide into the fuel, whatever the recommended amount is. You add it into the fuel because the biocide is the only thing that's going to kill that microbial contamination. You put in the right amount, you allow time for it to work, you circulate it in, and then you'll want to, if you do fuel filtration, you can do it then. If you're not doing fuel filtration, you're going to want to wait probably about 24 hours after applying the biocide so that the dead microbes can fall out of the fuel and not get caught in your fuel filters. And that's it. Your final recommendation step, or your final recommended step, is you do a microbial post-test in order to verify that the microbial levels have been reduced to the levels that are low enough for what you need. We think the best way to do this is by using a test method like ATP biofiltration. There are other options. We're partial to that one because it has distinct advantages. And we would also recommend that you do some kind of interval microbial testing at certain points after the service so that you can start building trends and start getting a clearer picture of how quickly and how often you'll need to plan service for your system, and so that you want to rely on recommendations developed for people that aren't you. And that's it. That is how to, or what to do if you have a microbial contamination situation in your system. So that is all for today's episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. Again, as always, you can find information on everything that we talked about in the show notes. We would ask, if you haven't done already, please subscribe at your favorite podcast platform, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, any of those. Leave us a rating if you haven't done so already, because ratings are really good for helping people find us and getting the word out. Thank you again for joining us for the last couple episodes at least. I am your host, Eric Bjornstad, your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel, and I will see you next time, the next episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast.